Imagine a hot summer day, the sun is mercilessly baking, and you are standing in anticipation of something that should bring you joy, rest, food, but instead you will have to face injustice. She is a young black woman, heavily pregnant. She just wants to sit in a restaurant, drink water, enjoy a tasty meal, take a break from the sweltering heat. But the hostess at the door looks at her and says in a cold voice, "You'll have to wait." An hour after hour she stands in the scorching sun, but a table is not freed up. There's just one detail the hostess doesn't even suspect. This woman is not just a customer. Her husband is the owner of this restaurant, and she soon finds out about it in the most unexpected way. What will happen when the truth comes to the surface? Now tell me, friends, where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments what city or country you are with us from today. The hot day dragged on painfully long. A pregnant woman named Jasmine stood on the steps of a restaurant, barely containing her inner tension and discomfort. Her belly was already heavy. Every step sent pain through her back and legs, but she tried to remain calm. She had made reservations in advance at this restaurant, a place that she and her husband considered one of the best in town. It was a restaurant he was proud of, because he had put his heart and soul into it and built a reputation from scratch. But at that moment, Jasmine felt completely alien in this place, as if she were a nobody. The hostess, a young white woman in her 20s, made no attempt to hide her indifference. She slowly scrolled through the list of reservations and barely glanced at Jasmine before snapping, "You'll have to wait, we're full right now." Jasmine sighed heavily, knowing that she would indeed have to wait, but what struck her most was the girl's tone, cold and distant. Jasmine knew that something was wrong. She had a hunch, subtle, but barely perceptible, that it wasn't just that the restaurant was full. She noticed how several people who had arrived after her had walked in without any problems. Despite not having reservations, they were greeted with smiles, shown to their tables. These people were white. A wave of indignation was slowly rising. Jasmine watched the time pass. 2 hours already. Standing on her feet, waiting in the blazing sun, the pain in her back was getting worse. Her legs were heavy. She tried to approach the hostess again. "Excuse me, how much longer do I have to wait?" she asked, trying to keep her voice polite despite her fatigue. The hostess didn't even look up. Her face remained impassive. "I already told you, there are no tables yet. If you are not satisfied, you can wait somewhere else." Jasmine's heart like a knife. A wave of pain and indignation rose up inside her. She tried to understand. Why should she stand on the street when other people who arrived after her calmly walked into the restaurant? She couldn't help but wonder, was it because of her skin color? Memories of other times in her life came flooding back. Small, painful moments when she had been looked down upon, ignored, or spoken to as if she didn't deserve equal treatment. Deep down, she knew this wasn't an isolated incident. That day, the restaurant was yet another reminder that, no matter how far society had come, racism still lingered in everyday life. At that moment, her heart sank with fatigue, not just physical fatigue, but mental fatigue as well. It was painful to realize that her own life, like the lives of many other black people, was lived under the weight of expectations that she would always have to be better, more patient, more reserved. Even when she knew she was being treated unfairly, she had to maintain her composure, because any display of anger could be perceived as stereotypical behavior, and she had to fight this every day. She tried to call her husband, but he was in an important meeting and did not answer. She did not want to bother him with trifles, but she was hurt and offended. It was a shame that in his own restaurant she was treated as a stranger, as someone who did not deserve basic respect. Another half hour passed. Jasmine could no longer stand. She felt sick, but the hostess continued to look at her with indifferent eyes. She felt anxiety growing. She needed water, air. She needed to sit down, but the hostess did nothing to help. Jasmine felt tears of humiliation rise in her throat. And suddenly, her husband Mark's car pulled up to the restaurant. He looked confident and calm as usual, but when he saw Jasmine at the entrance, his face twisted with worry. He quickly walked up to her, noticing how she could barely stand on her feet. "Jasmine, what happened? What took you so long?" he asked, looking at the hostess, who had now turned noticeably pale, realizing who was standing in front of her. Jasmine said with difficulty. "They made me wait. They said there were no seats." Mark looked at the hostess with an expression of indignation. Why did my wife wait outside for hours when people who arrived later than her were given tables immediately? The hostess hesitated, her face becoming nervous. Now she understood who Jasmine was, and that her husband was the owner of the restaurant she had been so proud of in front of the customers. I didn't know." The girl began to make excuses, but Mark interrupted her. "You didn't know, and that excuses your behavior?" His voice was calm, but there was a steely determination in it. "Does that excuse you leaving a pregnant woman standing in the heat? Or that you showed blatant disrespect just because you didn't think she was important enough?" The hostess looked down. She tried to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. "We work hard to make this restaurant a place where people come and feel welcome," Mark continued, his voice growing firmer. "But if my wife is being disrespected here, then how many other people have been turned away simply because of the color of their skin?" Silence hung in the air like a weight. Jasmine looked at her husband, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. There was so much pain and hurt inside her, but with him by her side, she knew she was no longer alone. Mark put his arm around Jasmine, holding her gently, feeling her tremble with exhaustion and hurt. He couldn't believe that such a humiliation had happened in his own restaurant. The place he was so proud of had become a platform for the very racism he had spent his life fighting against. Mark felt the anger boiling in his chest, but he tried to keep his cool. He knew that lashing out wouldn't help. He had to act, and he was going to do it in a way that would prevent anyone else from having to endure what his wife had gone through. But first, he had to take care of her. "Come on, darling," he said quietly to Jasmine, putting his arm around her shoulders. "We'll find you a place to rest now." He looked at the manager, who, having heard what was happening, came out into the hall, looking warily at his boss. "Bring me a chair and some water right now," Mark told the manager in a cold but firm voice. "And then we'll talk. We'll talk very seriously." Jasmine sat down on the chair she'd brought, feeling her legs finally get a break, but the resentment was still burning inside her. She looked at her husband. His jaw was tense, his eyes were flashing. Jasmine knew Mark wasn't the type to lose his temper easily, but he was on edge now. When the manager returned with the water, Mark took a deep breath and began. "How could this happen?" His voice was calm, but there was a storm hidden beneath the calm. "This place has always been for everyone. I repeat, everyone. Why does my wife have to stand in the heat when other guests come in right away?" The manager tried to justify himself. "Mark, I didn't know it was your wife," he began, but Mark cut him off abruptly. "What if it wasn't my wife? What if it was another woman? Another person who just came here for lunch? Are you saying that her skin color made her less worthy of respect?" Mark raised his voice, and there was a threat in his words. The manager tried to find words, but there were none. He knew that any attempt to justify himself now was useless. Jasmine looked at the stage, feeling a wave of emotion rise inside her again. It was not the first time she had experienced such treatment, but it was the first time it had happened in a place she thought was safe. She felt betrayed. "We can't let that happen," Mark continued, "not just for us, but for all the people who trust us, who come here expecting respect and good service, no matter what they look like or where they're from." He turned to the hostess, who stood to the side, cowering in shame. "Have you considered what it would be like to force a pregnant woman to stand in the heat?" he asked, his voice quiet but all the more menacing. "Have you considered that your actions could harm not only her, but her baby as well?" The hostess was silent, her face white with fear and shame. Mark looked at her again, then turned his gaze to the manager. "This is unacceptable. I will not tolerate this in my restaurant. You must decide how to fix this situation, and do it quickly, otherwise, I will find someone who can run this place better." Jasmine sat next to him, feeling the tension drain away, but the pain still lingered inside. She knew her husband's words weren't just aimed at this institution, but at the entire society that so often forced her and others like her to fight for their right to simply exist, to simply receive basic respect. Her entire childhood had been spent trying to prove that she was no worse than anyone else, that the color of her skin didn't determine her abilities or worth. But the world had so often responded with coldness and mistrust. Then she realized that she didn't want to remain silent any longer. She looked up at her husband, then slowly stood up from her chair, feeling all eyes on her. "We face this every day," she began, her voice quiet but confident. "Every time someone looks at us as if we don't deserve the same rights, the same respect. Every time we're asked to wait longer than others, or are served last. This isn't an accident. It's a system that's stacked against us. But know this, I'm not going to stay silent anymore. None of us should stay silent." Mark looked at Jasmine with pride. Her words were like a bolt from the blue. They broke the silence, and tension hung in the restaurant. Now not only the hostess, but the manager, the staff, and the guests who were nearby realized how deep this problem was. "We have to change something," Jasmine continued. "I won't let our child grow up in a world where he's judged by his appearance and not by his actions. This restaurant needs to be a place where everyone, no matter the color of their skin, feels welcome. And that's not just this restaurant, it's every corner of our lives." Jasmine's words, filled with passion and pain, made everyone in the room think. This wasn't just a story about racism in one restaurant. This was a story about systemic injustice, something that many people experience every day, and the need for change. Mark, standing next to her, was ready to support her in this fight. He knew that change began with small steps, with each individual action, with each decision to be better than he was yesterday. Jasmine stood before them, her voice firm but a storm raging inside. The words came out spontaneously, but each one carried the truth of her life, a truth that had been suppressed and ignored for so long. She watched as her speech shook the people present. They stood silently, shocked by what they had heard. Even the restaurant guests, seated at the tables, turned to listen to her every word. Mark stayed close, ready to support his wife at any moment, but there was pride in his eyes. He had never seen Jasmine like this. Her determination, her strength, her unwillingness to tolerate the injustice she had endured her entire life. He was ready to protect her, but he knew that at this moment she did not need protection. She was not a victim, but a leader, a woman who demanded respect and justice not only for herself, but for everyone in her place. The hostess, a girl named Emily, finally looked up, her lips trembling. She clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. Her face flushed with shame, and she took a step forward, trying to say something in her defense. I didn't mean to," she began hesitantly, but Jasmine interrupted her. "You didn't mean to?" Jasmine turned to her, her voice thick with emotion, but not anger. "You didn't mean to. It wasn't important to you. You looked at me and decided I wasn't worth your attention because my skin was a different color. That wasn't an accident. It was a choice you made the moment you decided to ignore me." Emily, not knowing how to justify herself, wrung her hands, but suddenly one of the guests broke the silence. "This is ridiculous." A male voice came from the far corner of the room. A man of about 50, dressed in an expensive suit, stood up from the table, his face expressing displeasure. "Are you all seriously discussing this? I was here when this woman came in. Yes, she waited for some time, but this is a restaurant, not a house for the privileged. Everyone is waiting." Mark turned around sharply, his eyes flashing with a dangerous fire. "And how do you explain the fact that other people who came after her got tables?" he asked, looking intently at the man. "Do you think this is normal?" The man grinned, his face becoming arrogant. "It's just a coincidence," he said with a shrug. "Maybe these people booked early. You can't just accuse people of racism because you didn't like the way they treated you." Jasmine took a step forward, her heart pounding. "A coincidence?" she repeated bitterly. "A coincidence that every time I go to places like this, I'm asked to wait longer than others? A coincidence that I'm looked at differently? A coincidence that I'm judged by my appearance and not by who I am?" The man didn't seem to be backing down. He snorted and waved his hand. "You're just making a big deal out of it," he said coldly. "Not everything in this world is about race." But at that moment something unexpected happened. A woman stood up behind the man, his wife. She leaned towards him and, whispering something, took his hand, trying to calm him down, but he roughly pulled her hand away. "I said it was nonsense," he repeated, his voice growing louder. I'm not going to let you accuse us all of being racist just because she couldn't get in on time. But then something even more astonishing happened. The same woman who had tried to stop him suddenly stepped forward with determination. Her face was flushed, but not from shame or embarrassment. Her eyes sparkled with determination. That's enough, John, she said sharply. You're wrong. The man froze, stunned by her words. Silence fell over the room, and all eyes turned to the woman. She looked at Jasmine and Mark, and then exhaled slowly. I know how it feels. Her voice was quiet but confident. I've been there myself. I've experienced prejudice in my time, too, and it's wrong. John, stunned by this turn of events, could not utter a word. His eyes widened. What are you saying? He croaked. You can't be serious. I can, she snapped, because I'm tired of staying silent. John, tired of watching people like you ignore reality. You don't understand that this isn't just one incident. This isn't a fluke. It's a system that we all support by turning a blind eye to these things. We're all guilty of allowing this to happen. Jasmine was shocked. She hadn't expected such support, especially from a man who had initially seemed to be an ally of her opponent. At that moment, it became clear to her that even those who had been silent for a long time could sometimes awaken to the truth. When I was younger, the woman continued, her voice shaking with emotion, I was made to wait, too. I was ignored in stores, at work. It was so long ago that I got used to keeping quiet and enduring, but now I see that silence doesn't change anything. I don't want my children to live in a world where people are judged by the color of their skin, and I'm not going to support those who think differently. John opened his mouth but could not speak. His wife turned to him and added quietly, If you can't understand that, I don't know if we can continue to live together. There was a deathly silence in the room. This statement was unexpected for everyone, but first of all for John himself. He looked down, not finding what to answer. Mark looked at Jasmine and nodded, saying quietly, The world is changing, and if we don't change with it, we will lose everything. Emily, the hostess, who had been silent until now, suddenly sobbed. All eyes turned to her again. She tried to pull herself together, but her voice shook with emotion. I really didn't understand, she said, but now I see. Forgive me. I had no right to treat you like that. Jasmine looked at Emily and saw genuine remorse in her eyes. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't looking for revenge or punishment. She wanted change. She wanted people to start realizing their mistakes and change. Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, Jasmine said softly, but it's not just about recognizing. It's about taking action, changing, trying to be better every day. It's not just about racism. It's about humanity. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She walked up to Jasmine and, unable to contain herself, quietly asked, I want to learn to be better. Help me. Jasmine looked at her and then smiled warmly. You've already started. The main thing is not to stop. Jasmine looked at Emily, who was still trembling with the last of her remorse and fear. Her face was stained with tears, and her eyes were filled with the desire to make things right. But Jasmine knew that remorse was only the beginning. The problem they faced was deeper than a simple misunderstanding. It was a system that had been ingrained in people for centuries, in their thoughts and actions, and cases like this were just the tip of the iceberg. Mark stood nearby, silently watching the proceedings. He sensed that his wife was about to say something important, about to go further, to dig even deeper, to where the roots of this problem lay. The silence thickened around them, broken only by the occasional whispers of the guests, who were confused by what was happening. Jasmine took a deep breath and spoke to Emily and then everyone present. It's not just what you did, Emily, she said, her voice finding its strength again. It's that you probably didn't even realize what you were doing. You were just reproducing the same stereotypes that we all do. They're ingrained in us from birth, and we follow them without even thinking about them. Emily nodded, agreeing with every word, but that didn't stop her from struggling internally. We grow up in a world where we're taught to see differences, not similarities. Jasmine continued, we're taught to be afraid of what's different from us, and you may not have realized that. You thought you were just doing your job, but here's the thing, even if you don't think about what you're doing, that doesn't excuse you from being responsible for your actions. The man, John, who had recently been shouting about the inflated problem, suddenly straightened up, trying to take control of the situation. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," he said again, annoyed. "This is a normal incident, and you're making a drama out of it. Maybe we're all just people who make mistakes. Why do we always have to look for racism in everything?" John's wife, who had been standing next to him, said quietly, "Because it is there, because we don't notice it, but it is in every action we take." John grinned, but his face was no longer confident. Conflict was seething inside him. He wanted to continue defending his opinion, but he felt that his arguments were weakening with each word. Jasmine turned to him again. "You are right, we can all make mistakes, but there is a difference between a random mistake and a system that supports such mistakes. The problem is that this system has existed for centuries, and we have become so accustomed to it that we have stopped noticing it." She came closer to John, her gaze direct and unwavering. "You're saying it's just a coincidence?" Jasmine smiled bitterly. "Let me tell you about my experience, about how I walk out on the street every day and feel like people are looking at me, how I'm suspected in stores, how I have to prove my right to just be here. A coincidence? It's not a coincidence when the same thing happens every day. It's a pattern." At this point, the restaurant was filled with a heavy atmosphere. People who had initially been simply observing the scene now realized the depth of the problem. They no longer saw before them a simple quarrel between guests and staff. This was a moment of revelation, when the truth was revealed that many preferred to ignore. "When I was little," Jasmine continued, her voice softening but still thick with emotion, "my mother would take me shopping. She would always tell me, 'Don't touch anything, don't look too closely at things, they'll think you're trying to steal something.' I didn't understand why then. Why were other kids allowed to play with toys in the store, but I wasn't? It wasn't until later that I realized it was because I was different, because they didn't see me as a child, they saw me as a threat." She paused for a moment, letting people digest what they had heard. "I grew up with this feeling," she continued, "the feeling that I had to prove that I deserved to be respected. But why should I have to prove anything? Why do people like you?" She looked at John again. "Think that their lives and their right to respect are more important than mine? Why should the color of my skin determine how I am seen and what I am ascribed to?" John sighed, his face tightening. It was hard for him to admit his mistakes, especially in public, but something about Jasmine's words resonated inside him, not because he was ready to accept his guilt, but because this was the first time he had actually heard her speak. "You don't know what it's like to always be in the minority," Jasmine added, "and to try to break the stereotypes that people project onto you every day. You don't know what it's like to not feel safe in a world that's supposed to be for everyone." At that moment, a voice suddenly interrupted her monologue. It was one of the elderly women sitting at the table by the window. "I grew up in the South," she said, standing up from her seat, her voice shaking, "and I remember when people like me sat in one place, and people like you sat in another. I remember being taught to recognize differences. And you know what? I grew up thinking that was the way it was supposed to be, that it was normal, but now I see that was a mistake. No one should feel like an outsider in their own country." All eyes turned to the woman. She stood in front of Jasmine and Mark, her hands shaking, and she looked like she was remembering moments from her youth that she had long since tried to forget. "I've never directly humiliated anyone," she continued, her voice shaking, "but I kept quiet when I saw injustice. I allowed it to happen, and that's part of the problem. I want to apologize, for myself, for those who came before me, and for those who still can't admit their mistakes." Jasmine walked up to the older woman and took her hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking into her eyes. "Awareness is the first step, but the next step is action. We must do everything so that no one feels excluded anymore." At that moment, a profound shift occurred in the restaurant. People began to realize that this wasn't just a story about bad service or a misunderstanding. It was a story about a systemic injustice that affected everyone. The silence in the restaurant grew more and more oppressive. People who had just been enjoying their dinner now sat in silence, watching this unexpected drama unfold. The old woman's words had touched everyone, as if they had torn away a layer of what had long been hidden beneath the surface, unconscious prejudices. suppressed history, an invisible but very tangible wall of division. Emily, the hostess, was still standing nearby, her face pale and looking like she wanted to sink into the ground. Every gesture, every word, every dismissive action, everything was now in a new light, but Jasmine could see that there was more behind that outward confusion, perhaps for the first time in her life. Emily was beginning to understand that her actions were not as innocent as they seemed. "You see, Emily," Jasmine continued, turning to the girl, "it's not your fault that you were born into a world that taught you to look down on others, but it's your responsibility to change the way you look at the world. Racism isn't just open hatred or rudeness, it's in the little things, in the way you ignore someone when you see them in front of you." Emily wiped away her tears, nodding. It was as if she realized for a moment that she was being offered more than just repentance in that moment, but a chance to be part of change. But John, the man who had begun to defend racist attitudes, was still full of resistance. His face was purple, and he was clearly not going to give in so easily. "This is just too much," he finally said, barely keeping his voice from breaking. "I'm tired of this talk about racism. Like everyone is the victim and we're the monsters. I'm tired of being blamed for everything. Doesn't anyone realize that accusing people of racism just because they did something wrong is also unfair?" His words came out sharply, and several people in the restaurant nodded approvingly. It seemed as if he was giving a voice to those who might feel attacked or tired of the endless talk of racial injustice. Jasmine looked at him carefully, her eyes showing neither anger nor resentment, only weariness from having to explain the obvious over and over again. "John," she began quietly, but her voice was filled with power. "You say you're tired of talking about racism. Imagine what it's like to live with it. You get tired of just hearing about it. But I, and people like me, live with it every day. For you, it's just an annoying conversation. For me, it's a reality that shapes my every move." John opened his mouth to object, but Jasmine continued, "Do you feel guilty? It's because for the first time you're confronted with the fact that your view of the world may be wrong. It's an unpleasant feeling. I know, but here's the difference. You can choose to ignore it or not. You can go back to your normal life, without changing anything, and still feel right. But me, I can't ignore the color of my skin. I can't pretend that the world doesn't see me differently." At that moment, someone new entered the restaurant, a tall, elderly man with gray hair at the temples, dressed in an expensive suit. He glanced around the room, stopping his eyes on Mark and Jasmine. A whisper went around the restaurant. It was the manager of the restaurant chain, Mr. Thomas Richardson, the man who owned this place. Everyone knew that his appearance meant only one thing: the situation was out of control. Mr. Richardson strode confidently up to the counter where Jasmine, Mark, and Emily stood. He looked at the hostess with a cold, appraising gaze, then at the guests, and finally spoke. "I've been informed that there's been trouble here," he began quietly, but with obvious professional irritation. "I'd like to get to the bottom of what happened." His voice was calm, but it carried the authority of a man accustomed to being in control. It seemed as if he was about to defuse the situation, as he had done many times in his life. But Jasmine sensed that this was not a moment to simply settle. This was a moment of truth, and not just for her, but for everyone present. She took a step forward, meeting Mr. Richardson's gaze. "We can't just handle this any longer, Mr. Richardson," she said. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. It's a systemic problem that affects not just this restaurant, but the entire country." He frowned, his eyes narrowed, but Jasmine continued. "I stood here as a black woman, pregnant and exhausted from the heat, and I was made to wait, not because there was no room, but because I was denied respect. You might think it's a small thing, one incident, but you know what? For me, it's not a small thing. It's every day of my life. It's a constant reminder that I'm not seen as a person, but as the color of my skin." Mr. Richardson paused, his face set in deep thought. He had clearly not expected this reaction, but something in Jasmine's words had made him pause. It seemed that even he, a man who had always sought profit and success, was beginning to understand that sometimes the world required more than just profit and rules. But then a voice was heard that had been silent until then. "I was here too," the man in the corner, who had been watching the proceedings with alarm, suddenly intervened. "I saw her being kept waiting, and I want to tell you that it's wrong." All eyes turned to him. He was another regular at the restaurant, a middle-aged white man who had been a neutral observer until then. His unexpected support caused a murmur among the crowd. "I was part of this world too," he continued, "and I never paid attention to such things, but now I see that if we remain silent, we will contribute to this injustice. Mr. Richardson, this is not just an incident, this is a call for change." Mark looked quietly at Jasmine, his eyes expressing support and pride in the way she was handling this conversation, but he knew it wasn't over, and that real change would be long and hard. Mr. Richardson exhaled slowly, his confidence wavering. He was a businessman, used to being seen as a problem solver, but now he was faced with something much bigger, a moral dilemma that he couldn't simply walk away from. "I realize that a serious mistake was made today," he finally said, "and I acknowledge that perhaps we need to rethink our views on service and respect for every person, regardless of their background." But Jasmine was not satisfied with this statement. "Revise?" she repeated, her voice cold. "This isn't something you can revise overnight. It requires fundamental change. Your system isn't just your restaurant, it's your entire society. And change starts here, with the little things, with the situations you think are insignificant." She paused, looking into Mr. Richardson's eyes. "We can no longer afford to be deaf. We can no longer remain silent." Mr. Richardson looked at her, understanding the depth of her words. It seemed as if the entire restaurant held its breath, waiting for his answer. "You're right," he finally said, his voice quieter. "This isn't something that can be resolved overnight, but I'm willing to take the first step." He turned to Emily, who stood next to him, still shaking with emotion. "Emily," he said quietly, "I don't blame you for this situation, but I realize now that we all need to learn. We'll create a new training program for all of our employees so they understand how to properly treat people, regardless of their background." Jasmine nodded, her face softening. "Education is just the beginning," she said, "but change has to go deeper, inside each of us." And in that moment, everyone in the restaurant realized that something had truly changed, not just in this restaurant, not just in this situation, but in the world around them. They had witnessed how one woman, black, pregnant, and exhausted from waiting, could stir the hearts and minds of people and make them face the truth. Jasmine was relieved when Mr. Richardson agreed with her words, but deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey. Training employees was a first step, but no one could guarantee that real change would happen. People like John, living in their bubble of privilege, were not ready to admit the problem. This conversation had changed something, but it was unlikely to touch the most stubborn ones. The problem was much deeper, and Jasmine knew it. Mark stood next to her, his face tense. He could see how much Jasmine was going through, and it was unsettling. Although she was stoic and had this conversation with strength and dignity, there was a storm raging inside her. Her pregnancy and her fears for the future of their child were taking a huge toll on her. Her fear for the world their son or daughter would grow up in was real, unbearable. But before Jasmine had time to answer Mr. Richardson, when the door to the restaurant suddenly swung open, a police officer appeared. His presence, oddly enough, immediately brought even more tension to the already tense atmosphere. He looked around the room, then walked towards Jasmine and Mark's table. Something in his gaze made Jasmine wary. "Mrs. Jasmine Williams?" the officer asked, his voice dry and cold. Jasmine slowly raised her head, her heart starting to beat faster. She exchanged a worried look with Mark. "Yes, it's me," she replied, trying to remain calm, although her anxiety was growing. The officer looked at her, then at Mark, as if assessing them. "Could you come with me? We have some questions regarding an incident that occurred in the parking lot near the restaurant." Jasmine frowned in confusion. "What incident?" Mark stepped forward, his voice sharp, almost aggressive. "What are you talking about?" "A call came in," the officer continued, ignoring Mark's tone, "that a car with a broken window was spotted in the parking lot. It appears to be your car, Mr. Williams." Mark turned pale. "What? Our car?" Someone broke the glass? His voice shook with anger. Who did it? We're still sorting out the details, but I'd like to ask you to come with me for questioning, the officer replied dryly. Jasmine felt a chill run through her gut. Her gut instinct told her this wasn't just a coincidence. It was all too strange and suspicious. She looked at Mark, then back at the officer. Wait, she began, trying to make sense of what was happening. You want to interrogate us? But why? We have nothing to do with this. The officer looked at her again carefully. This is standard procedure, Mrs. Williams. We're just following protocol, but I need you to come out with me. John, sitting at his desk, chuckled, throwing out a loud comment. You see, order is being restored. Maybe they are not as perfect as they seem. This comment added fuel to the fire. Mark couldn't take it anymore and stepped forward, his face distorted with anger. You mean to tell me it's our fault? He roared, heading towards John. You dare blame us when someone crashed our car? The officer immediately stepped between them, raising his hand to stop Mark. Calm down, sir. I ask you to calm down. But Jasmine knew this was getting out of hand. The intensity was too much. Her own fear mixed with worry for Mark, for their unborn child. She felt her chest tighten, and it became hard to breathe. It was too much emotion, too much pain, too much pressure. We did nothing, she said quietly, her voice shaking but firm. It's not fair. You're trying to make us feel guilty about something we're not guilty of. The officer looked at her with the cold detachment with which men in uniform often look at those they consider different. There was no understanding or sympathy in his eyes. He was following instructions, but those instructions were steeped in prejudice. I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Williams, he replied, taking a step back. If you don't want to complicate things, I suggest you follow me. Mark was on edge. He looked back at John, who was watching the proceedings with a mocking smile, as if enjoying the whole thing. It was him, Mark said suddenly, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. It was him who broke the glass. I'm sure of it. There was a noise in the restaurant. People began to whisper. Mr. Richardson frowned, but did not intervene. The situation was too complicated for him to simply offer his business solution, and John seemed surprised, but his surprise quickly turned into a smug grin. Me? Are you crazy? He chuckled. You accuse me without evidence? It's funny. But at that moment, something changed. One of the restaurant's employees, a young waiter who had been standing in the corner and silently watching, suddenly stepped forward. I saw someone break the window in the parking lot, he said quietly, his voice shaking. It was a man in a white shirt, like the gentleman there. He pointed at John and the restaurant fell dead silent. John paled, his smug grin gone. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. It's a lie, he cried, finally gathering his courage. You're trying to blame me. This is all a farce. But it was too late. The waiter did not look away, and now everyone present began to look at John with suspicion. The officer seemed to be thinking too, his face tense. I'll need to ask you a few questions, he said, turning to John. Mark and Jasmine stood next to each other, their hearts still pounding with adrenaline, but they knew the truth was coming out, and while it didn't solve everything, while racism didn't disappear with one revelation, in that moment they had one. Mark and Jasmine stood there, stunned by the unexpected turn of events. The young waiter who had dared to speak out against John had sent shockwaves through the restaurant's guests and staff. Everyone was waiting for a reaction, but no one knew how the situation would unfold. The waiter's words hung in the air like the rumble of an approaching storm. This is just ridiculous. John, although he looked noticeably paler, did not give in. He jumped up from his seat, demonstratively looking around. Do you believe these words? The guy could have made it all up. Why do you believe them and not me? Mr. Richardson, who had been trying to maintain a semblance of calm, suddenly found himself in the middle of chaos. On one side was his regular customer John, on the other were accusations and rising tensions in the restaurant. However, the atmosphere around him was too tense to simply ignore the truth. The officer frowned, looking at John, and took a step forward. Mister, if that's the case, you have nothing to worry about, he said, his voice turning cold. But if we find confirmation that you did break the glass, That will change. But Jasmine couldn't calm down. On the one hand, everything was starting to line up against John, but on the other, she felt like it wasn't over yet. There was a growing anxiety in her soul that hadn't left her all day. She looked at Mark, and their eyes met. There was a shared fear in them. This moment was just the tip of the iceberg. "Let's go outside," she said quietly to Mark, feeling the panic wash over her again. "I can't be here anymore." Mark nodded, understanding that she needed to get away from this tension. He took her hand and began to lead her out of the room. The waiter who had testified against John looked after them, his eyes full of sympathy. But as soon as they reached the door, a loud voice stopped them. "Oh, here they go." John's voice was sharp. "Of course they're running away. When the real test starts, they don't want to be here." All eyes turned back to Mark and Jasmine. It seemed that this last attack was the last straw. Jasmine slowly turned around, her eyes full of anger and pain. "We're not running away," she said firmly, her voice clear and distinct. "We're leaving because we're tired of people like you getting away with the way you're behaving now." John was about to say something in response, but at that moment the door of the restaurant opened again, and a woman entered, tall, stately, with light skin and hair gathered in a strict bun. She walked quickly, with an obvious purpose. Everyone fell silent when they saw her. Indignation was written on her stern face. "What's going on here?" Her voice was full of authority and confidence. It was Evelyn Richardson, the wife of the restaurant owner. She was known in the city not only as an influential figure in the business world, but also as a person who always supported social justice and spoke out against racial discrimination. Everyone, including her husband, froze immediately. With her arrival, the situation took on new weight. Her gaze immediately fell on Jasmine, then on John, who instantly paled when he saw her. He clearly hadn't expected this woman to appear. "I came here when I heard there was trouble here," she began, looking around at everyone gathered. "I was told someone discriminated against a black woman and that a car was damaged. I want to know what's going on." Mr. Richardson stood up, trying to take the floor. "Evelyn, honey, this is a misunderstanding. We are trying to figure everything out." But she interrupted him. "A misunderstanding?" Her voice was chilling. "Is it a misunderstanding when a pregnant black woman has to stand in the heat and wait because she was refused service? Or when a car window is broken and they try to exonerate the guilty party? Is that a misunderstanding, in your opinion?" John, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, stepped forward, trying to justify himself. "It's just a coincidence," he insisted. "Do you really believe that I could have done this? It's absurd." But Evelyn walked straight up to him, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "John, you've been on my radar for a long time. I know that you and people like you think they can get away with anything, but I see everything, and I'm tired of turning a blind eye to things like that. You show your true colors time and time again, and you know what? Your time is up." She turned to the police officer. "I demand a full investigation into this incident, and if the evidence points to John, I will personally make sure he is held accountable for everything." John, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, took a step back. He knew that he had no chance against Evelyn Richardson. But at that moment, something unexpected seemed to happen. Jasmine felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She grabbed her side and screamed, trying to keep her balance. Mark was immediately there, supporting her. "Jasmine," he screamed, his voice full of horror. "What happened?" She sighed, feeling a cold sweat run down her back. The pain was sharp, sudden, and intense. Her heart began to pound even faster. She knew the stress of the last few hours would have taken its toll on her, but she hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly. "It's a baby," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Mark, something's wrong." Mark didn't hesitate for a second. He picked her up in his arms and, after taking one last look at everyone in the restaurant, hurried to the exit. "We've got to get to the hospital," he shouted to the officer and Mr. Richardson, who immediately realized the gravity of the situation. "I'm not going to wait another minute." The officer looked at Mr. Richardson in confusion, but Evelyn quickly intervened. "Let them come. This is the most important thing now. I will contact the doctors so that they can be met at the hospital." the situation in the restaurant changed instantly. The guests froze, shocked by what they saw. All their conversations, racial prejudices, arguments, all this retreated for a moment in front of the fear for the life of the woman and her child. Mark carried Jasmine outside, and luckily there was a taxi waiting for them at the entrance. He quickly helped her into the back seat, and they immediately headed to the nearest hospital. "Everything will be okay. Everything will be okay," Mark whispered, holding Jasmine's hand, but the fear was too great to believe these words. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors rushed Jasmine into the operating room. Mark waited in the hallway, his hands shaking, his thoughts racing. He felt like the world was crumbling around him. Everything that had happened in the last few hours, the injustice, the insults, the car accident, no longer seemed to matter. Now his whole life depended on what the doctors said. Several hours passed before a doctor came out to see him. He was wearing a mask, but his eyes expressed fatigue and anxiety. "Mr. Williams," the doctor began, "your wife required emergency intervention. The baby's condition was critical, but it has now stabilized. Jasmine, however, is still in serious condition. We will need to monitor her closely over the next few days." Mark almost collapsed with relief. The baby was alive, but Jasmine... He grabbed his head, trying to calm the trembling in his hands. "Can I see her?" he asked in a breaking voice. The doctor nodded, his expression remaining serious. "Yes, but she may be a little disoriented after the anesthesia. It would be best if you were with her to support her when she wakes up." Mark nodded and hurried to the room, his heart beating so fast it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He opened the door, ready to see Jasmine, and was relieved to see her already lying on the hospital bed, her face calm, although the look of worry never left it. As he approached her, he saw her eyes slowly open. Their gazes met, and in that moment it became clear to him that they had to stay together in this fight. "Mark," Jasmine said, her voice quiet and hoarse. "What happened?" He leaned closer, trying to hide his own emotions. "You're okay, darling," he said, trying to sound calm. "We're at the hospital. You were safe, and so was our baby." Jasmine closed her eyes and sighed, her face a mixture of relief and fear. "I was so afraid that something was wrong," she whispered. "I don't want our child to grow up in this world." Mark felt the lump in his throat grow even bigger. All those hours spent in the restaurant, all the arguments, prejudices, and racial biases, it all suddenly weighed on him like a weight they couldn't bear, and he knew they had to be willing to fight for their child. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "We'll do everything we can to make sure our child doesn't know fear like we do. We'll protect him from all of this." Jasmine opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze full of hope, but also fear. "But how?" Her voice was full of despair. "How can we change this world? It is full of hatred and prejudice." Mark took her hand, trying to convey his confidence to her. "We will fight," he said firmly. "We will speak out. We will show that people like John cannot continue their actions with impunity. We will do everything to protect our family and others who face similar discrimination." Jasmine smiled through her tears. "It's so important to me," she whispered. "I don't want our child to experience what we're experiencing. I want him to know that there are others who support him, who love him." At that moment the door of the ward opened slightly and the doctor entered again, a worried expression on his face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, but his voice was full of compassion. "I'd like to discuss Jasmine's condition with you." Mark looked at the doctor, waiting for him to continue. "Your wife had quite a difficult case, but she has stabilized, and that is good news," the doctor began. "However, I need you to know that the stress she has been experiencing may affect her recovery, so it is important that you both remain calm." Jasmine, as if understanding what the doctor was talking about, looked at him with concern. "Should we still be careful?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," the doctor nodded. "I recommend that you both limit your contact with the outside world for a while. Your body needs time to recover. We will monitor you and take care of you while you are here." Mark and Jasmine exchanged glances. He thought the doctor was right. They did need time to deal with the effects of stress, but the world outside was still going on, and John was probably already trying to cover his tracks, getting away with it. He couldn't let that happen. "Doctor," Mark said, his voice becoming more determined, We need to do something. We can't just sit here and hope that everything will work itself out. We need to tell what happened." The doctor looked at him with understanding, but with some doubt. "I understand your concerns," he said. "However, given Jasmine's condition, I strongly recommend that you focus on her recovery. We will do everything we can to assist you." Jasmine looked at Mark, her eyes shining with tears. "You're right, we have to do something," she said, raising her hand and squeezing his. "We can't let other people go through what we went through." Mark nodded, and he felt determination building inside him. A few days later, Jasmine began to recover. Although her fears remained, Mark was still there, supporting her and making sure she didn't become overwhelmed. They decided that as soon as she could, they would gather a group of people to start a movement for the rights that people like them should be defending. They knew that the only way to combat racism and bias was to talk about it openly, to create space for discussion, to bring people together. But before they could begin, they received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Richardson. "I want to meet you," he said, his voice tense. "I have information about John that you need to know." Mark and Jasmine looked at each other, realizing that this could be an important moment. They agreed to meet Mr. Richardson at a nearby cafe. Even during their conversation with the doctor, they discussed that they must do everything possible to find the truth and achieve justice. When they arrived at the cafe, Mr. Richardson was already waiting for them at a table in the corner. He looked worried. "Thank you for coming," he began when they were seated. "I've been thinking about what happened for a long time. I'm ashamed of what happened in my restaurant." Mark and Jasmine were silent, waiting for him to continue. "I talked to some people and found out that John has connections with a certain group that deals with racial discrimination and hatred. They do plan various actions against people who, in their opinion, pose a threat to their values. It may be connected with what happened in the parking lot." This information shocked them. "So he's not just a normal person?" Jasmine asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "He's part of something bigger?" "Yes." Mr. Richardson nodded. "I fear this is only the beginning. He may be capable of more than just breaking glass." Mark felt the adrenaline rush through him. If John was truly part of the group, his actions could have far more serious consequences. "We have to act," he said, making his decision. "We have to tell the police. If there is a way to stop them, we have to do it." But Mr. Richardson stopped him. "I'm not sure that's the best move," he said. "I know how this group works. They can retaliate. They have a lot of resources at their disposal. The best thing would be to arrange a meeting with those who can help. I know people who are involved in human rights work who can help us." Jasmine, still aware of the gravity of the situation, felt like they were wasting time again. "We can't just sit back," she said, her voice firmer. "I can't let them keep doing what they're doing." "I agree." Mark nodded. "Let's try to contact these human rights activists and see what we can do." This is how their journey to organizing a movement against racism and bias began. They gathered people, voiced their stories, and created a space where everyone could share their experiences. With each new participant, they felt that they were becoming stronger. But there was a threat on the horizon. John and his group would not leave them alone. They continued to watch, and their intentions became clearer. Now it all depended on whether Mark and Jasmine could create enough pressure to counter this hatred that had remained invisible for so long. But time was against them. Every day they faced new threats and manifestations of racism. Their movement needed support and confidence, but they knew that at stake was not only their safety, but also the future of their child, who was to be born into a world free of hatred. They understood that now they had to show courage and fortitude to win. The day after their meeting with Mr. Richardson, Mark and Jasmine decided there was no time to waste. They began working on setting up a support group and mobilizing the community against racism. It wasn't easy, especially since they were both under stress and Jasmine had just been through a tough situation, but they were determined. The couple decided to hold their first meeting at a local park where people always gathered. They created a simple leaflet inviting anyone who had felt discriminated against or had experienced difficulties because of their skin color to come and tell their stories. We have to show people that we're not alone, Jasmine said as she prepared the leaflets. Her hands were still shaking from the experience, but there was a fire in her eyes. If we gather enough people, they'll see that this isn't just our fight, it's the fight of everyone who experiences hatred and prejudice. On the day of the meeting, they arrived at the park early to set up the area. There were many locals there, and soon people began to gather. As they handed out leaflets, they saw interested people stopping to listen. It wasn't just African Americans who gathered, but people of other ethnicities who had also experienced prejudice. A small group gathered around them, ready to support their efforts. As they began to talk about their experiences, the atmosphere gradually became filled with emotion. One by one, people came forward to share their stories. "I was fired from my job just because I was black," said a young man named Eric, his voice shaking with anger. "I was one of the best employees, but when it came time for a promotion, I was told that the company was looking for other candidates. I knew it was a lie." Jasmine listened to Eric. She thought of John, his hateful words and his look of contempt. These thoughts filled her soul with anger again, but also determination. The next speaker was an elderly woman named Loretta, her voice full of wisdom. "I've seen the world change in my lifetime, but the hate remains the same. It hides behind a mask, but sometimes it rears its head, and we must be prepared to fight it," she said, her eyes shining. "Our strength is in unity. We must join our voices to be heard." Mark felt a sense of shared strength growing within him. He turned to Jasmine and saw that her eyes were filled with tears. She, too, felt this wave of support and unity. "Thank you, Loretta," he said, trying to create a dialogue. "You are right, we must be united to stop this hatred that still exists in our society." After a few speeches, a young woman with long curly hair approached them. She introduced herself as Tiffany and said, "I want you to know that I support you. We can do more than just share our stories. Let's create an organization that will defend the rights of all people, regardless of the color of their skin." This idea suddenly ignited a spark of hope in them. The idea of creating an organization that would work against racism and bias became the central theme of the next meeting. Everyone in the gathering felt that this was not just a conversation, this was the beginning of real action. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly. They created social media, developed plans to bring people together and raise awareness about racism. They began organizing rallies, involving local media. While Jasmine and Mark worked on this, they tried to keep their own health in mind, especially since Jasmine was in her last month of pregnancy. But they still managed to find time for each other, and that was very important. They did everything they could to support each other through the stress, realizing that despite all the difficulties, their love was stronger than anything. One day, in the midst of preparations for another rally, Mark came home and noticed Jasmine sitting on the couch with a grin on her face. "What happened?" he asked, feeling his heart beat faster. "I just talked to Eric," she said, not hiding her excitement. "He found information about John. He's been living a secret life, and it looks like he's not the only one in this group. There are a few other people who are connected to him." Mark's heart began to pound. He knew this might mean more than they thought. "What should we do?" he asked, leaning forward, full of anticipation. "We need to get this information out there. This is what we need to show that John is not just a regular person. He is part of something bigger," Jasmine said confidently. "But how? It could have consequences. I don't want you to be in danger again," Mark said, his voice filled with worry. Jasmine walked up to him and took his hand. "I'm not afraid," she said, looking him in the eye. "We can't be afraid. We must be brave and act." That evening, they discussed how best to approach the situation. They knew they had to be careful, but also decisive. Going public could be dangerous, but staying hidden meant losing. The next day they contacted Eric to discuss the details. He introduced them to a local journalist who was known for his reports on racial discrimination. They met in a small coffee shop, and Mark and Jasmine told him everything they knew about John and his band. The journalist, named Ben, listened to them carefully and then said, "This is serious information. We must approach this wisely. If it is true, it could cause a huge resonance." They agreed that Ben would conduct his own investigation to gather evidence. He also suggested that they stay away from John and his group until the information was confirmed. Over the next few weeks, they waited. Jasmine was still preparing for the birth, and every time she felt a contraction, her heart pounded with fear. But she also felt a deep sense of satisfaction that they were starting something important that could make a difference in society. One night, as they sat together watching a movie, Jasmine suddenly felt a sharp pain. "Mark!" she cried, her face turning pale. "I feel sick." Mark immediately came to his senses. He saw her eyes fill with tears and understood that this could be a sign of the onset of labor. "Hold on, I'll call a taxi," he said, his voice shaking with excitement. But at that moment she grabbed her stomach. "No, something's wrong. I can't breathe." Mark's heart stopped. He felt that they might be in some new danger. He quickly helped Jasmine up and they went outside, where it suddenly started to rain and the night became a gray fog. The taxi was not coming right away and he knew that time was running out. He suddenly remembered that he had a neighbor who worked as a nurse in a hospital. "Stay here, I'll quickly go get Lisa," he said, leaving her on the street. He returned a few minutes later with Lisa, and when she saw Jasmine, her face immediately changed. "What happened?" she asked, running up to them. "She can't breathe," Mark said, his voice full of fear. Lisa checked on Jasmine and instantly knew it was serious. "We need to go to the hospital," she said, taking command. "Let me take her in my car." Quickly moving Jasmine into the car, they headed to the hospital. Mark sat in the back seat next to Jasmine, holding her hand, trying to calm her down. Her breathing was becoming more and more ragged, and Mark felt anxiety growing inside him. "You can handle it, my love, I'm with you," he whispered, although he himself felt that he couldn't control the situation. When they finally arrived at the hospital, they were met by a doctor. They quickly took Jasmine to a room while Mark waited in the hallway, his heart pounding. Several hours passed before a doctor came out to see him. He looked tired and his expression did not bode well. "Jasmine is fine, but she's in premature labor and we need to monitor her condition," the doctor said. "We'll do everything we can, but she needs time to recover." Mark's heart sank, knowing that they were now in an even more vulnerable position. He couldn't help but think about John and what he might do. But despite all the difficulties, they knew they had to keep fighting. Within days, they were faced with new challenges. Jasmine was in hospital, and every day Mark came to her, supporting her and telling her that they were moving forward. At this time, Ben, a journalist, continued his investigation. He found several people who were ready to speak out against John and his group, and soon they were going to hold a press conference to talk about racial discrimination in society. When Jasmine was discharged from the hospital, she still felt vulnerable, but she couldn't pass up the opportunity. "We have to speak at the press conference," she told Mark. "I want our voice to be heard." He looked at her, knowing she was right. This was their chance to talk about what they had experienced and unite people against hatred. On the day of the press conference, they arrived together, and Jasmine held her newborn son while Mark spoke about his struggle with racism. Their story became a symbol of the struggle, and soon others joined them to share their own experiences. The press conference was a success. Many journalists attended, and their messages about discrimination began to spread throughout the city. People began calling the editorial offices, expressing support. Soon, this wave of support began to gain momentum. But amidst this joy and unity, John did not leave them alone. They knew he could still strike, but they were ready to fight. With each new day they became stronger and more determined. Now they understood that uniting people is the key to changing society, and no one can stop them. It was their time, and they were ready to defend their right to live free from hatred. Despite the growing support and attention they received after the press conference, Jasmine and Mark knew that the real fight was just beginning. Although they had become symbols of resistance to racism in their city, John and his allies were not about to give up. Instead, they began to intensify their actions, and tensions grew with each passing day. One morning, while Jasmine was feeding her newborn son, she received a text message from Eric. "John has no intention of staying in the shadows. He is rallying his supporters to respond to the press conference. Expect him to be aggressive." Jasmine's heart began to beat faster. She showed the message to Mark, and his face darkened. "He wants to intimidate us," he said, his voice full of determination. "We can't let him silence us." Jasmine nodded, but there was a growing sense of unease in her soul. She knew that their actions could have consequences, and they had to be careful. However, she knew that if they backed down now, it would mean that hatred would win. That evening they met with Ben to discuss the situation. Jasmine and Mark told him about their concerns, and Ben was no less worried. "We must prepare for the possibility that John and his group may try to respond to our movement. We have several ideas on how to support you and protect you, but we must act quickly," Ben said, his face reflecting the seriousness of the situation. Over the next few days, they began to prepare. They gathered information about John and his group, trying to figure out their intentions and actions. Ben conducted an investigation, collecting evidence about John's connections to radical groups and their plans. One day Ben came with new data that shocked them. "I found information that John is gathering people to attack our next protest," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "They want to create chaos and intimidate us into stopping the fight." Mark clenched his fists. "We can't allow this. We need to strengthen our defense and get the message out to all the participants in the action." Jasmine felt fear creeping up on her, but at the same time, a desire to fight grew within her. She understood that their movement was more than just a fight against racism. It was a fight for the rights of all people. The next day, when they held a meeting with the participants of the upcoming action, the atmosphere was tense. People were discussing how to protect themselves, how to avoid possible clashes. At this time, one of the participants, an older man named Walter, stood up and said, "We must not let them intimidate us. If we all stand together, no one will be able to break us. We must show them that we are stronger than their hatred." These words inspired everyone. They began to discuss how they could organize protection to avoid violence. The decision to involve local human rights organizations and create a large group to protect the protest became the main point of discussion. A few days later, when the day of the protest arrived, they were determined. Jasmine and Mark arrived at the protest site, supported by a group of more than 100 people. People held signs with slogans about peace and equality, and the atmosphere was full of anticipation. But there was tension in the air. Jasmine could feel her heart pounding as they waited for it to begin. She was ready to speak up and share her experiences, but at the same time she was worried about what might happen. Suddenly Mark came up to her, his face serious. "I just saw some familiar faces. They look like they're coming to see us. John might be with them," he said. Jasmine felt fear wash over her, but she remembered Walter's words. "We can't let them intimidate us. We have to move forward and show that we are united," she replied, trying to suppress her anxiety. The rally began. Jasmine walked up to the podium, her voice confident despite the hesitation inside. "We are here because we are tired of hatred," she said, looking around the crowd. "We are here to show that we are a society and we have the right to live without fear and discrimination." The crowd cheered her on, clapping and raising their hands, but Jasmine knew their opponents could arrive at any moment. And then it happened. There was shouting and noise from the crowd. She saw a group of people, led by John, moving towards them. Their faces were full of hatred, and they were carrying posters with offensive slogans. "This is hate! This is hate!" John shouted, trying to stir up the crowd. "You have no right to be here." At that moment, the crowd tensed and Jasmine felt a sense of anxiety wash over everyone. "Stay together," Mark shouted, raising his hands to calm the people. "We are stronger than their hatred." But John wasn't going to back down. He started to raise his group, and there was a threat in the air. Jasmine saw some of his followers start to push and shove their group. "We won't give up," Jasmine shouted, her voice full of determination. "We won't let you intimidate us." The crowd responded with cheers. They were ready to fight, but fear still took hold of Jasmine. She knew the situation could get out of control. Suddenly, sirens began to sound. Police came to the rescue and began to separate the groups. Mark saw some of John's supporters trying to get to Jasmine and quickly rushed to her side as police began to break up the clashes. "Jasmine, follow me," he shouted, holding out his hand to her. But the crowd had become mixed and she found herself surrounded by people. Jasmine felt her heart beat in time with the tense atmosphere. At that moment, someone pushed her and she fell to the ground. Chaos broke out around her. People were screaming. Someone grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the crowd. "Jasmine," Mark shouted, trying to push through the people. To her horror, she realized that she was lost. "Leave me alone," she screamed, trying to free herself from the hands that were holding her. She still held her son in her arms, and her only thought was to protect him. But at that moment she was captured, and John stood nearby, laughing. "There you are, Jasmine. You thought you could stop us?" he said with disdain. Her heart sank. She realized that John was willing to do anything to intimidate them. "We will not give up," she said with difficulty, despite her fear. "Yes," he chuckled, "that it looks like we have a lot of work to do." Mark was currently fighting with several people trying to get to Jasmine. He felt his anger flaring up and he was ready to fight to protect her. "Let her go, you bastards," he shouted, bursting into the crowd. The police finally started to intervene and they tried to separate the two sides. It was not easy. The conflict escalated and many people started pushing and shouting. But just when all seemed lost, members of the local human rights organization that had been mentioned at the meetings burst into the crowd. They stood shoulder to shoulder to protect those in danger, and soon formed a human chain around Jasmine. "We will not allow you to intimidate our family," one of the women at the front screamed as John and his followers began to retreat from the growing number of defenders. Jasmine, standing in the center of this chain, felt protected as never before. She saw Mark making his way toward her, and her heart filled with hope. "We're in this together," he said, taking her hand and holding their son close. "We'll get through this." John, realizing that he had lost control of the situation, cursed and began to retreat. "You're all going to pay for this," he shouted, his voice full of anger. "You can't just get rid of us." But this time his words did not frighten. Instead, they only fueled the rage and determination in the hearts of those who stood together against hatred. Soon the police had dispersed John's crowd, and all that remained were the sounds of sirens and cheers that echoed throughout the perimeter of the event. Even though Jasmine was filled with emotions, fear, anger, but also pride that they had stood firm, she knew this was not the end. It was just the beginning. That day, they became part of something bigger than just fighting racism. They became part of a movement that wanted to change society. They knew there would be hardships ahead, but they weren't alone anymore. Their hearts were full of hope and they were ready to continue the fight for a future free of hatred. Despite the storm that erupted at the rally, the spirit of unity that emerged in response to the threat had a profound effect on the entire community. Jasmine, Mark, and their son, surrounded by new friends and allies, felt like they were part of something bigger. In the weeks following that unforgettable day, a wave of change began to sweep through the city. People, inspired by their bravery, began to unite to support the movement for human rights and against racism. New initiatives emerged, including organizations that focused on education, legal assistance, and support for victims of racial discrimination. Jasmine and Mark became active participants in the movement. They organized meetings to share their stories and support others who had also experienced discrimination. Every week, rallies were held in the park, where people discussed their experiences and proposed ideas on how to make society more equitable. One of the highlights was an exhibition dedicated to the fight against racism. It was held at a local gallery and featured many pieces of art created by local artists. Jasmine and Mark were inspired and decided to exhibit their photographs and stories of how they dealt with hatred. At the opening of the exhibition, they saw the local community come together to show their support. The room was filled with portraits of people who had fought racism, each piece telling a unique story. Jasmine felt her heart fill with pride as she looked at the smiles of the people around her, and their eyes filled with hope. Ben was also at the exhibition, reporting on the event. His camera was there to capture every moment, and he filmed Jasmine and Mark talking to other participants, brainstorming ideas on how to continue the fight. Ben captured their smiles, the joy and strength they got from this unification. When Jasmine and Mark gave their speech, they were surrounded by applause. "We've been through a lot, but this is just the beginning," Jasmine said, her voice full of confidence. "Together, we can create a society where everyone has the opportunity to be heard, respected, and loved. Mark added, "This is not just our fight. This is the fight of everyone who has ever faced hatred and discrimination. Together we are stronger, and we will definitely succeed." After the exhibition, they were inspired to create a permanent organization that would support and protect human rights. She and Mark began to assemble a team of like-minded people who shared their vision. They were joined by Walter and other protesters who also wanted to continue the fight. They organized meetings to discuss plans and ideas for moving forward. Each of them brought something unique to the table. Some knew about legal issues, some about social work, and some had experience organizing events. Gradually, they achieved success and their organization attracted the attention of local media. Thanks to this, they were able to receive funding for their initiatives. Soon, educational programs on combating racism and supporting diversity began in schools and universities. Jasmine and Mark became well-known figures in their community and their story inspired many. They were invited to speak in other cities, sharing their experiences and the importance of uniting against hate. At one point, when their son turned 2, Jasmine and Mark organized a celebration of all they had accomplished. The event brought together friends, family, and supportive allies. They celebrated not only their accomplishments, but also those who had stepped up to help them when they needed it. At the end of the evening, when the sky darkened and the stars began to shine over the city, Mark lifted his son into his arms and said, "This is all for you, my boy. We are fighting for a world in which you can live without fear and with hope for the future." Jasmine smiled as she looked at their son and realized that they had truly done something important. Hate could not prevail as long as people were united by love and support. Their story, their struggle, became a symbol of the fact that, despite difficulties, it is possible to create a society based on mutual understanding and respect. Everything they had been through had led them to this moment, a happy future full of hope and love. They were ready to continue their fight, but now they not only had a goal, but also a family to support them. And at that moment they realized that happiness is not in the absence of problems, but in the ability to overcome difficulties together and build a better future. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear from you if you have had similar experiences in your life where you have experienced or witnessed racism. Your stories are important to us and can help others realize how much unity and support mean in the fight against hate. We value each of you and want you to know that your opinion matters. Subscribe to our channel and like it so you don't miss out on new inspiring stories and important discussions. Have a nice day and stay in touch.